I'm Tim Etchells. I'm Artistic Director of Forced Entertainment, which is an experimental theatre company, or it's a theatre company. It's an ensemble of artists working together in Sheffield since 1984. And one of the projects that I'm responsible for is this production, That Night Follows Day, which was first performed in 2007, written and created in 2007, but has been done in many different contexts since then, including most recently in London last December. We made a new production of it with a group of 17 young people from London, aged between 8 and 14 years old.
I'm Hester Chillingworth. I'm a maker and theatre director, and I've worked with Tim and Forced Entertainment in various capacities over the last 10 years, most recently heading up their participation work, a lot of that being with children and young people. And I co-directed That Night Follows Day with Tim at the South Bank Centre last December.
So maybe to speak about That Night Follows Day and the start of it, because the first production of it was in, I think, 2007, and I had an invitation from what was then called Victoria in Ghent, which is now called Campo, and they had a kind of, one of their missions was the idea of working with young people to make performances for adult audiences. And they had made one piece with Josse de Pauw, who's a Flemish director, a piece called Übung, and they wanted to make a second work in that line. They were thinking of a trilogy. So they invited me to make the second piece, which was part of a trilogy, but only insofar as it was another work made with a cast of young people for an adult audience. And then the third part of the trilogy was a work by Gobsquad, which is called Before Your Very Eyes, I think. So they made that after my one. But the invitation initially was an open one, basically to make any performance, so long as it was with a group of young people, whatever age I would like, and however many. So it could be with 2, or it could be with 20 or whatever. And I thought about it, and I decided I would try to make a piece with a group of 15 or 16 young people. And the thing that I had in my mind was the idea of the school photograph, where all the kids are lined up and supposedly on their best behaviour. I mean, this kind of very classical chorus, straight line, we've all been arranged and here we are, which certainly, you know, as part of my childhood, I think every year you had a school photograph like that, where somebody stood you in a line and took your picture. So that was one reference point, and I decided to work, or to try to work, with young people aged between 8 and 14. And I think part of, I mean, I didn't explicitly know this at the time, but I realise now that I have 2 kids who at that moment were 8 and 14. So it was pretty obvious, thinking about it, that was, you know, part of my reasoning. And I was interested to make this work that somehow reflected on, as I was, you know, thinking of it, the ways in which the adult world makes and shapes and frames the experience of young people. And I was thinking about that in terms of parenting, I guess, and maybe it was me saying to myself, what are you doing? You know, like, what is this structure that you're in, and that these kids are in? But it was also, I think, I was thinking about, you know, the way that teachers interact with kids, with young people, next door neighbours, other family members, random strangers. I mean, the whole world, in a sense, is a construct that is somehow letting its opinion be known, and sort of framing the experience of young people. And I kind of wanted to do a work that tried to map that and deconstruct that and think about that, and with the idea that what would happen would be that the young people would replay all that at an adult audience. So it was a sort of, the performance was meant to be a moment of confrontation. It was like saying, well, here we are arranged for you as a school photograph, all standing in a nice little line, all speaking chorally. It's all very lovely, but guess what? This is what you do. 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 And, you know, formally the piece has only 2 or maybe 3 moments where that formal address breaks. And the idea was that it was a sort of, I mean, I often think about performance projects in this way, you know, that there's a desire to sort of take something apart and look at how it works. It's, you know, I really do think about these things like taking the engine out of the car and laying all the pieces on the ground and sort of staring at them, wondering if you could put it back together again, or maybe, you know, or maybe don't. So it was an attempt to do that, really, and very explicitly to confront an adult audience with this diagram of the power structure, and I think to also to start from this very organised chorus, and then to break that down and fragment it. So it begins in a very well-behaved, well-ordered way, and it becomes increasingly fractious and difficult, and kids have different opinions, and they get very interested in the fact that the adults are always telling them no about this or that, or they start to report on all of the racist or xenophobic or misogynist or unpleasant things that adults are saying around them. And in a way, you know, what starts as a sort of performance of complicity in a system becomes a sort of debate. It becomes a debate amongst the young people, and in a sense with the audience, about what is going on here. Formally, you know, it's very simple and very tight, but that was the desire, you know, that's where that piece came from, just this desire to map and try to sort of think a bit about that structure of adults and children in the world, and how in the world we live in, and how that works. It was made, the first version, in a very workshoppy way. So I worked it was probably an 8-month process, working in the evenings, working on some weekends, working in the school holidays, that kind of thing. And the first cast, you know, were responsible for lines in the text, or, you know, discussions. We just talked a lot about how that whole thing works. I drew on their material all the time when I was writing and stitching things together to make the performance. And also it drew on their energy. So, you know, there were kids who were, you know, they had attitude, or they were rebellious, so they became like rebellious figures in the performance. There were kids who were look like, the ones you would select to show a new child around the school or something. They look lovely and very well behaved, and they got roles that grew around what their, sort of personas were. So it sort of made, I think, as I always tend to work, it was made on those young people and with them and with their energy and with some sense of their voices and their personalities. And then, in a sense, once that cast were done with the piece, because it toured a lot, then other people came into the piece, but they would just fall into those roles. So you'd be looking for somebody who could do that rather mischievous role, or somebody who could be the really sensible older boy or sensible older girl or whatever, to sort of hold the structure of the piece together sensibly. So it's definitely changed. Their relation to it has changed over time. And in all the different versions that we've done, as readings or as a full production like we did in London, young people come into it in a slightly different way. Maybe you sort of talk about the process of making the London version. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. That was a shorter process than the 8-month process Tim's described for the original. We held some auditions in July, I think, and we cast it before the summer holidays, and then we rehearsed essentially every weekend between the end of September and the middle of December, when the show was, with a couple of extra days and things like that. And so that was a very intensive, slightly more traditional rehearsal process. So it wasn't really workshop based. We did do one workshop before the summer to facilitate the process of updating the script, because the original production was 2007, this was 2018. So that process that Tim was going to go through with updating the script, we wanted to do a session with the young people to inform that. So finding out, what their conversations are, what their concerns are. There were some specific things we had in mind, like in the original script, there's no mention of mobile phones, or not much mention of things like the internet and gaming and stuff like that. And so we wanted to just talk with the cast and get some more sense of how it might come into a more present form, really. So we did that. That was a workshop session. But other than that, Tim updated the script, and then when we hit the ground running with rehearsals in the September, it was quite an intensive, real kind of line learning and position learning process. So we kind of peppered the rehearsals with games and exercises and things like that, so it wasn't too much like the army, but to an extent it was a bit like the army. It was like, we used to joke about like, what flavour of boring rehearsal do you want to do? You can do this bit of chorus boring rehearsal or this bit of solo boring rehearsal, but essentially, it was really a lot for them to learn, and especially some of them were really young, 8, so it was a case of them managing to do it by December was really the project we were on with that. But the process of casting them for that had a lot to do with their ability to do it. They were a very successful cast and they made a fantastic show. And they were incredible in it, and lots of people were commenting on how did you find these amazing performers. And actually, in the audition process, you are looking obviously for confident performers, or at least people who can stand there confidently. But more than that, I suppose, it's this thing Tim was mentioning where you're looking for people who are going to be some kind of organic fit with the persona types that you need in the piece. And I think if you can get that fit right enough in the casting, then as long as the young people don't suffer from extreme stage fright or something, as long as they want to do it and you can coach them, you'll get a great performance, because it's sort of an opportunity for them to speak out more or less as themselves. I mean, obviously, it is, it's not their words, but they we talked a lot about how they're not pretending to be a character, or they're not acting a story or making something up. It's about bringing your own frustrations or your own curiosities or your own insecurities or your own questions to this opportunity to speak to the adult audience. So I think, yeah, they were really successful, and it was really great. And I think that has a lot to do with this thing of these clear kind of persona types that you're filling really in the cast.
I mean, I think one interesting thing is that I think both with that production, the one that we did in December, we also do this kind of really quite fast project, which is like a rehearsed reading version, where we work for maybe a few weekends or maybe a 5-day intensive period, and at the end of that period we will present a kind of reading where the young people have got the scripts in their hands and they're performing to an adult audience, which would probably be a lot of their families and friends of families and so on. That's very quick, and again, to do that piece, because it involves speaking in unison, and it's a lot of language, there's a lot of hard work. It's really not a kind of just do whatever you like, guys. It's quite an intensive, demanding sort of project. But I think what's interesting is that I think all of the young people who do it, even the short the rehearsed reading version, they gain this thing which is learning about how they can sort of manage their presence in front of other people. And I think it's there's two things. I think there's, on a kind of performative level, there's something about being able to stand in that line at which the piece is kind of built on and look out at 100 people or 100 people, or look out at 200 people in a theatre and just be like, yeah, no problem. Which if you're 8 or 16, if you're 8 or if you're 16, that's quite something. And what's interesting is that I think some young people come to the auditions and it's almost like they can already do that, because whatever, I'm not sure how that happens, but they're comfortable in their own skins and they can deal with, they're there, And you also, at the same time, you get a lot of young people who have been in those versions of the show, who you put them in front of audience and in the line, and they're immediately, in a terror, and they're sort of trying to deal with that. And what we do is we work with them to give them skills and confidence that when it comes to it, they can be there and they're amazing. And I think that's a set of skills about owning your presence and being where you are and communicating that they all take away with them. It doesn't matter if they want to be actors. I don't think that really matters. It's more about what is it to be a person in front of other people, and how do you own that situation. And I think even when we've done a very quick rehearsed reading version, all of the young people take that away. It's like an amazing sort of physical skill that not skill, something about like a way of being, really. It's another way of thinking about your presence. So that's a constant thing that we're working on.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we're working on with them, of course, is that the text is a kind of textbook deconstruction of the situation that they're in. So it's very empowering for them to sort of see this map that other young people have fed into, that they may have fed into, which we will always have discussions with them about when we're working. It's like, oh yeah, okay. So it's sort of almost like somebody draws for you the box that you're in. And actually when you're in that box, it's quite hard to see it. which, you know, I think politically that's one of the ways that the project is working. It's one of the things that the project wants to engage with, is that, you know, I think many of us are caught in, you know, apparently normal situations, socially, politically, which we can't see, and we don't know that they're weird because we're not able to see what the shape of the construct is. I mean, that's how it works, isn't it? So in a way, the project, I think whenever we do it, I think all the young people, it's like a kind of intensive training about what kind of structure am I caught up in as a young person. And I think parents often comment on that to us. You know, they'll say, well, thanks thanks for teaching them all of that, you know. So it is in a way it's a political consciousness raised. It also gets them to think about the power structures that they're in, and about the different ways in which they, as a diverse group of young people, might occupy those power structures. So, you know, the London cast, maybe it's, you know, worth talking a bit about the casting from the London version.
Do you mean
just in terms of diversity, in terms of the mix of people.
Yeah. Well, it was a super diverse cast, which we were really, really happy about, and it was a mix of. It was racially diverse. It also was economically diverse, and one of the parts of the kind of audition process was the young people had to write a paragraph of why they're interested to be in it, and there was something about what experience you've had on stage, and some people have been members of several youth theatres and done various productions and things like that, and other people haven't done anything apart from maybe a school drama class because they don't have access to that opportunity. So having that information in the casting was super useful as well, because it would help to make sure that what we were putting together was a group of people that was diverse in loads of ways, one of which is opportunity and economic advantage or disadvantage. Also, we had George and Alex in the cast who are both deaf and spoke in British Sign Language. So having that diversity of language was a really immediate kind of fantastic shake-up of everything that was going on, actually. It just suddenly this kind of given that you have about, well, we're all going to speak in English and we're all going to be speaking verbally, it just goes out the window, you know. And so in terms of power dynamics and power structures and whose voices get heard and things, that was shaken from the start in a really exciting way. And that was an education for everybody, I think, on all sides, working together in that way. And one thing that came out in the process that was really exciting, and this actually was a more workshopy moment, something that just emerged. We were playing a sort of exercise game where each young person could come on stage. I mean, it was just in the rehearsal room, it wasn't on a big stage, but they could come onto the performance space, and they had a minute to do whatever they wanted, and everyone else had to watch. And we really tried to talk to them about really thinking about what they wanted to do, so not what they thought we wanted to see or what they thought they should do or anything, but really what they wanted to do. And one of the cast members, called Joelle, was really hanging back, and she kept letting other people go. And I thought it was because she was embarrassed or she didn't know what to do or something. And it got to the point where everybody had gone apart from Joelle. And so I said, okay, Joelle, you need to go. And I thought she was going to say, oh, I don't want to. But she just walked on stage and then just stood there. And then she just started speaking in Japanese. And it was fantastic because everybody was... nobody could understand what was happening. My brain was thinking, why don't I understand what she's saying? Everyone was just... It was this fantastic moment where she'd obviously, I don't know, been aware maybe of the value of what she was going to do or something and kind of held it back. So after this moment where she spoke in Japanese, we all spoke as a group and we said, okay, who knew that Joelle could speak Japanese? A couple of her close friends did. What was the effect on us all when she started speaking in that language. We didn't know that she spoke, and people talked about how it was like a book opening. They thought they knew her, and then it was this whole other dimension of her as a person. And so then people started putting up their hands and saying, oh, well, actually my first language is German, or my first language is Hebrew, and there was 17 young people, and more than half had a first language that wasn't English. So in the show, there's one moment where there's only one moment where they use a microphone. The rest of the time they're just speaking unamplified, and in that moment they say their name and a promise. So my name is Hester and I promise to always be on time, or whatever, and pass it down. And so in this production that we just did, several of them, I would say about half of them, when it came to their turn, they spoke in their own language. So we had Japanese, we had Hindi, we had Hebrew, we had German, we had all sorts of languages. We had the 2 BSL speakers, and then obviously some people speaking English. So that moment became a really powerful point in the middle of the show, where you realised in the audience, I think, that you would visually assess them as diverse, but there's obviously a whole invisible, many invisible layers of complexity to everybody and experience to everybody. And it sort of really opened up the fact that people are so many layered and so complex and so different, and that we can't, whatever you assume you know about somebody, there's loads of stuff you don't know, And it was so powerful, and it came, I think the fact it came from them. And on the last night, the final night of the whole show, I said to Joelle, do you realise that if you hadn't done that in that exercise, that section of the show wouldn't be there? And she kind of brushed it off and didn't seem too bothered. But I really wanted her to understand that that is collaborating and that is devising, and that it is the value of that is huge. And it wasn't that we let that bit be in the show. In fact, it was an amazing offer. It was, so fantastic, so rich, so much better than what any of us could have thought of. And just by her kind of really bringing herself to the exercise, with no agenda, because she wasn't planning to make a piece of the show, she was just offering herself into the exercise, and that's when you make really good things happen. And I think she got the hang of that, but she's a bit too cool to kind of really say much about it. But yeah, that was definitely very exciting. That was very exciting for me, because it really highlighted to me, if we hadn't made the time in that rehearsal to do that game, for example, that wouldn't have happened. So it really reminded me about, you can have your schedule and your agenda and whatever, but about kind of carving out space for the unexpected. And it might not happen, but at least you're going, okay, let's see what else. So that was a really great lesson in that for me.
Maybe it's interesting to think about the relationship between this piece and other pieces that, or other projects that the two of us are kind of involved in, and especially ones that we've been involved in since That Night Follows Day, because I think this sense that the young people are in some way the owners of and the authors of what happens. They might not own the text these days, because it is usually a fixed thing, but there are other ways in which they kind of make the piece come to life and offer themselves into it as a structure. But I guess in that project, you're always dealing with the relation to a text. It's a written thing. It's whatever it is, 16 pages of this unpacking of what the relation between adult world and young people world is about. So I think in reaction to that, I think there's been a couple of things that have been on my mind and which were on our minds when we were thinking about, what might be next. I think in broad terms for me, one of those is, that Night Follows Day is very much about this sort of the force of the adult world and how it presses down on young people and how they exist inside that and how they push against that in different ways. But it is nonetheless this kind of structure. And I think it made me think in very broad terms about, would it be possible to make something next, or to work next in a way that was more about trying to work not so much on this energy of pressing down, but on what would it be to open up the freedom of space that young people or children might have access to. And that's, I think, broadly speaking, that's led to a couple of things. One is that, I have thoughts about and plans for a couple of projects working with young people where there would be I think a very different energy, not starting from this school photograph, everybody well behaved and speaking in unison, but starting from something that's much more unruly and different and chaotic and coming from different places. And then in parallel to that, we started out parallel to that, we started our discussions about the project Art Breakers, which is a kind of young people's performance club in a way, workshop, which takes place every week in Sheffield, where Forced Entertainment are based, and which draws on a group of young people who come every week to do different things. And our discussions on that were about, what would it be to make something that wasn't focused on getting a really good performance, but was focused on creating a kind of open laboratory workshop, try lots of things, draw on performance art, draw on experimental music, draw on experimental theatre, draw on photography or video making, just bring all of these things into the room with them and play, and see what might be possible. And I think in some ways that the freedom of that as an initiative is probably a reaction to having spent so long working on That Night Follows Day, which is all about about that, power structures. So it's sort of almost like, how do you get out of that and start thinking in a different way?
So I ran Art Breakers for its first year, and my experience in that, in terms of thinking about any kind of showings or shows, or even revisiting exercises from one week to another, is the young people had a really interesting reaction to that, where in large part it seemed that for them to start rehearsing something which had enjoyably come up through kind of chaotic play killed it. They would really hate to rehearse something. They would love to do a thing and be like, oh, that's fantastic, and talk about it and critique each other about it and laugh about it and remember it. They would hate to rehearse it. And I had some interesting conversations with them, talking about, saying just kind of about how could you put that kind of energy and that kind of material and that kind of work on stage what could be the ways. I mean, obviously, I think I know what some of the answers to that are, but trying to get them to think about that. And they, you know, because they're quite young, I guess, but they were saying, oh, just get out there and do it. Just don't plan it and do it. And then obviously we're talking about the fact that then it might just be really rubbish. You know, often you do stuff that's not interesting as well as interesting when you're just messing around. But I think that's something that really struck me is, I guess, in the contemporary theatre world and the Four Sense main company work and kind of work I've been involved in making in my career, that process, that adult process of editing and shaping and building something very precise out of mess, and it might still look like mess, but it's very precise. That's the joy I so far haven't been able to communicate to young people, or I've been able to maybe communicate it, but they've been like, no, that isn't a joy. That's that's very boring. It's, you know, what they fed back to me is that's the undoing of what we're doing. So that was really interesting for me about that the Artbreakers space for them. It seemed almost quite sacred, that it's like we just do and do and do. We don't rehearse. We don't revisit. So it's interesting. And maybe that's and I think some of them have said this, it's because it reminds them of school, because in school you're having to learn and go back over your homework or go over the chapter you've all done or whatever, and there's a feeling in that some of them have expressed, there's a feeling in that room that if it's all new, which doesn't have to mean every single thing you do is new, but each time you do it, it's a new version, then it doesn't feel like school, apparently. It's interesting.
It's also maybe interesting that Artbreakers, to some extent, has had a kind of, you know, in the year that you were doing it developed a kind of almost like a sort of self-governance, you know, that the young people who make up the group became increasingly, I suppose, important in terms of establishing and understanding what the culture of it as a thing is. You know, what do they do? What don't they do? Why do they do that? Why don't they do that? And of course, you know, you're there in a position mediating and framing and somehow trying to intervene in that. But you know, I had the impression that it really was, as time went on, a kind of negotiation with a powerful group of people who've been here for, you know, six months or 9 months, so they know what they're talking about. And that's very different than recruiting a group of young people and doing a project over a long weekend. You know, the way the conversation works is different. I'm not saying that a project over a long weekend is bad. It's just different. And actually, the long-term, ongoing, keep coming back every week, keep encountering ideas, keep getting fed up with the same person for doing the same kind of thing. I mean, you know, all of those dynamics, which we know very well from 30-odd years of collaboration, but, you know, they start to get a taste of what that is as well. And also the power that goes with it, the responsibility as well, to make the group work for each other and for themselves. I think it's, on that level, also politically interesting as a space that, you know, does have adult, it's a space that does have adult framing, but it is a space where they're powerful and where their opinion about whether to do a showing of the work to an audience or not makes all the difference, because they choose basically what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's very different than a production-oriented process like That Night Follows Day, which is a commission in a very particular sort of frame, which is intended from minute one that it would lead to a professional production in a festival. That's one route, but this kind of workshop model where we're working over a long period of time with a group of young people, it's just a very different way of thinking, I think, and working, and which produces different kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some people in Art-Breakers, for example, you might not very readily cast in That Night Follows Day, because they're not particularly comfortable being looked at and being watched, and I suppose that's the big difference. Is although performance is the basis of Art-Breakers, and they do watch each other every week, there's a sense of privacy about the group, I think, and some young people who've joined it have expressed that they feel very awkward in life generally, and they don't, they feel embarrassed out and about at school and stuff like that, and they're definitely not the people who would be wanting to be standing in the spotlight in the middle of a stage. But in this kind of closed group of experimentation that doesn't have the idea of an impending audience, then they're really willing and wanting to be part of seeing what can happen, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the other thing to like plug in would be the way in which I think all of this work for us, whether it's That Night Follows Day or Art-Breakers or any of the other projects that we're developing, they're all built on the idea that maybe in young people there's an opportunity to sort of get away from the kinds of narrative or normative, theatre structures for understanding the world. That in young people there's a sort of capacity and an intuitive understanding of other ways of thinking and doing. Whereas I think a lot of the time when young people are taught theatre and stuff, they're taught very 19th century ideas about what a person is and what a character is and what a story is, and it's also it's also old, and actually they have a very quick understanding of non-narrative work and a very quick understanding of all kinds of fluidity and playfulness and so on, which have been important forces in my work in forced entertainment, in Hester's work with us, and in their own sort of work with other people. I think it's I think there's a tendency that drama, for example, drama with young people is quite conservative. And I think we're part of, obviously a slightly wider field of artists who are beginning to think about how live art and experimental theatre practices can be a way of opening up a dialogue with young people that's different and encourages them in other ways of thinking, and also takes advantage of the capacities that they have already to think in different ways and to work in different ways, because they don't need a lot of the things that the adult world would suggest to them that they do need. They're actually amazingly sort of quick and versatile, artistically and intellectually if you're prepared to challenge them, to throw them in at the deep end with some tricky exercises or experiments. You know, they can be alive for that and awake for that. Because I suppose, you know, you can have the understanding that in some part the process of being educated and going from being a child to being a grown-up is so-called is it's a process of losing and you know, being stripped of different capacities and opennesses, as much as it, of course, it's also a process of gaining this, that and the other. But I think there is a process of losing touch with and losing contact with other ways of thinking and being. So it's sort of, yeah, that's important. And the other important thing is that when about working with children and young people, is that there is the possibility there to work with children and young people from different social backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different kinds of experiences, which as people get older, it's harder and harder to sort of find a route to bring people to a forced entertainment performance. There'll be the kind of people who will go to the arts centre or to the theatre, and there's the kind of people who probably won't go. And it's hard to cross bridges and make contact with people later in life, but somehow when they're younger, because of school structures and because of youth groups or for whatever reasons, you stand a little bit more chance of getting a range of young people and actually having an opportunity to have a dialogue with people that you might not otherwise be in contact with. And I think that's really important going forwards, that kind of access is not restricted to only like middle class theatre school kids, stage school kids, we say. We can, when we're doing that Night Follows Day, a bit of that's okay, but we're always determined to find a way to reach outside of the obvious kind of context in order to make contact with different people who might otherwise not get that kind of opportunity. Maybe is it useful? We should maybe talk a bit about playfulness and childishness in relation to the work. I think it's funny in relation to the Night Follows Day because it is mostly this sort of very disciplined chorus which starts to break down in different ways, and there's one sort of rather more riotous and unruly section where they're chasing each other and fighting and screaming and so on. I must say I've had people say to me that that bit looks the most fake to them. That the kids young people are great in all of the more controlled parts when they have to be themselves but inside these structures. But when they're on a stage and somehow asked by the piece to play as if they weren't being watched or something, then I think people find that harder. I think it's harder for them too, to be honest. It's not a natural situation. And
it is the most pretended moment, really, because it's suddenly pretending, they have to kind of pretend they're not being watched, whereas the rest of the time they're acknowledging that they are being watched.
Yeah. So it's interesting, but I think maybe about playfulness in more general terms. I mean, I think in the forced entertainment work, we've always had an understanding that you know, underneath theatre, there is a kind of a connection to the processes of imaginative play, pretending, dressing up. I mean, all the things that you do as a child, which are kind of ways of transforming space and time, basically, by imagination and by action. And those things are very interesting to me in a way that drama and plays is absolutely not interesting to me. I'm not interested in those things, not really. I'm interested in the way that putting a costume on or just speaking some words that don't belong to you is a way of changing the world. It's a way of making something happen. Or interested in the way that, throwing water over your head or emptying the tomato ketchup bottle all over you changes something, That seems really connected to me to the kinds of things that young people and children know, very innately. It's just part of how you understand and experiment on the world up to a certain age. So I think there is a really big connection there. I don't particularly think of it as childishness. I'm interested in the idea of playfulness, and also interested in the idea that playing is serious. That playing's a way of processing the world, playing's a way of changing the world, and those things are what, in a sense, what underwrites drama or theatre or film. I mean, it's at the bottom of all of those things is that kind of desire to act differently in the world in order to test what the world is. And I think that's something that young people and children do, innately.
I also think there's something about less about childishness, more about sort of intentional inappropriateness.
Yeah.
And I guess children are inappropriate a lot, but often because they didn't realise what was meant to be appropriate, so often that would be unintentional inappropriateness. And I suppose as soon as you're intentionally inappropriate, then you are pushing the edges of things, causing a bit of a problem. You're playing around, and it might be funny, or it might be rude, or it might be a bit dangerous, or it might be all of those things. And I suppose one of the things, if you see adults wearing stupid dressing up costumes or something, then because of what we imagine for ourselves as adults about dignity and things, I think there's an intentional inappropriateness about that, and people think you shouldn't wear that, you shouldn't act silly. Basically, you shouldn't act silly when you're grown up, because it's not appropriate or dignified or sort of powerful. It's not kind of authoritarian or something. So I suppose I see it more like that, as an act of intentional inappropriateness than childishness specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another thing that we have been exploring in the forced entertainment work, which would connect also, I think, to elements of Hester's work in other contexts, is that idea that sets of rules or systems are quite useful to establish something that you're doing on stage or in a workshop situation, because it becomes a framework that people can immediately understand and then feel empowered to either contribute to or participate, or to just read, like you understand in That Night Follows Day, when they're making these lists of statements to the audience, when they're doing the promises, when they say we promise to be home by 9 o'clock, we promise to do our homework, and then somebody says we promise not to say bad words like motherfucker or arsehole. You know that person's breaking the rules because you've seen what the rules are. Was supposed to be a section of complicity and sort of giving in to the structure, and then somebody breaks the rule by swearing and promising to do something, but at the same time they're doing it. So it subverts the situation. But in a sense, you can't have subversion unless there's an understanding of what the rules are. And that's why I think, very often in the forced entertainment performances and in projects like The Night Follows Day, or in things that we might have done in the frame of Art Breakers, there is a thing about what are the rules. And they're partly there because the interest in them is, okay, what are the rules and how can we break them? What would it be to break this situation? And that's kind of how Art Breakers started, right?
Yeah. The first Art Breakers project we did, which was a half-term project rather than this weekly after-school session. We did 3 days in an October half-term as a kind of test for the whole idea. And on the first morning, as a group, we all wrote on big paper what we thought the rules of theatre were, and then the task over the 3 days was to sort of make a piece in which they broke them all. And it was very sweet. Some things were just like standing with your back to the audience, or having your script on stage, or you mustn't eat on stage, things like that, and just that very direct thing of what have we got on the list, now let's break it, was good fun. And they were ticking them off and trying to think, they were like, okay, one of the rules is you have to be heard at the back. Okay, how do we break that? What should we do? Let's all whisper. No, let's not say anything. And just coming up with different ideas of how you could break it, all of which generate weird and great material. So it's a really nice way in, actually. And already feels rebellious then, I think. And just exciting. I think the same is true for Art Breakers and That Night Follows Day. There's something in them both about the young people realising that they can occupy the stage in the way you would talk of occupying Parliament Square or something. They're not just standing on stage to do a thing for us. It's their space, and really they should occupy it, and take that space and own that space, and therefore control that relationship with the audience. And I think there are just a very few power structure relationships that children can have much control in. When there are adults involved, that is. So kind of opening up that space and going, that's your stage, occupy it. And the adults are there and they won't say anything and they'll sit there patiently because that's the rules of theatre. It's kind of just a great opportunity for young people, I think. It's quite exciting.
In Live Art Denmark, we've often been presenting kids to various games like haircuts by children. They were taught how to cut adults' hair, or making their own money in Sibylle Peters' Kinderbank. And so we were presenting various aspects of the society as games. How are the games of banking and this and that. But you're actually in this work teaching theatre, the game of theatre to children. And but what is more, it's more than the game of theatre is also about taking a space. The game of playing band is not about taking a space, but the game of theatre, this taking a space and being there, standing for what you stand for, is much more essential to the game of the theatre than to the game of cutting hair, game of painting. So in a sense that you sounds like this project of the Outbreakers is preparing kids in a much more fundamental sense to play the world for the life than these other games we have presented kids to. It's like it's strengthening them individually as players before they enter any game, in a sense.
Yeah, I think very much you're talking about what you could do on stage as much as you're talking about what you could do in the world in Heartbreakers, I think. And most conversations, they might start about a performance that someone in the group has done, you know, an exercise, or about a video we've watched. But the conversations will always go out into the world, which I guess is maybe you could say, I don't know, one of the big differences between your more traditional play-based theatre and experimental theatre and live art. You know, because theatre that is saying we're here now doing this, not we're in some fictional landscape. It's already in the world, if you see what I mean, rather than stepping out into a fictional world. And so whatever you do on that stage, it counts on the stage and it counts in the world, both at the same time. And I think that is a key thing with Heartbreakers. Things about how you take up space, or how you perform yourself, how you perform relationships with other people, how you read situations, things like that. You know, they're all things about the world, actually. And I suppose we're kind of, the question goes a bit backwards. It's almost in Heartbreakers you say, look at this bit of life. Could we imagine that could be art? You know, it's a bit like that kind of, what do we see in the streets around us, or this advert, you know, or whatever, and thinking about the lives that they're in. They'll talk about stuff that happened at school, you know, and they'll say, oh, I saw someone carrying a gym mat round school all day, and I thought they're doing a fantastic art piece, you know, and they're starting to see things that are happening in real life and going, that's an art piece. So I suppose, really thinking about those frames of how you interact with the world, and how your presence in the world counts, or how other people's presence in the world counts.
Yeah, but I think as well, you know, what there's, you know, this idea that a training, you know, an encounter with performance and with with different ways of thinking about performance, being a person who's doing something, presenting something, doing an action, working inside a set of rules. I mean, one can see that in a very narrow way, as if it were all about producing art, about producing, you know, performance. But of course, it's always about something else. It's always about what is it to be a person in the world, what is it to be, to negotiate with other people, to take risks in a situation, to take risks with how you present yourself, to take risks with what you say, and so on. So I think all of these things are kind of operating on both levels all the time in a project like Heartbreakers, and in the, you know, I think in the kinds of things that we will do around a presentation of the Night Voller's Day, that it's sort of, I suppose it's about understanding what your value and what your possibilities are as a person. and as a player, understanding the world as a game, understanding the world as a game in which you can make moves and other people have to react is actually quite a cool understanding to have when you're 10. I mean, and the funny sort of work was they already know it, so it's like you're helping them, you're underlining a set of ways of thinking that they're probably half of them are there anyway. You're just making it more explicit and getting them to think about it and talk about it and share strategies. So I think there's a lot of potential in that work. And the education system in the UK is increasingly focused on information and very mathematical ways of assessing where the young people are. It's an obsessive kind of audit culture. And I think the kinds of thinking and negotiating and subverting that go on inside an art practice, like the kind of thing that we're interested in, they're very, very different, and I think probably going to be increasingly necessary because the education is more and more this act of pressing down. I think it's less and less and less and less space for creativity or for thinking about different ways of understanding the world or being in the world. It's all incredibly, the drama's being pushed out, even the kind of traditional drama that kids often do inside schools, that's getting pushed out. So it's quite important, I think, that artists are finding ways to radicalize young people or to help them realize their potential. They kind of know it to some degree, but it's just helpful to amplify that. I think that's a bit what those projects are about.
Do you have specific goals for this work, like presenting new works, or are you just seeing what happens?
I mean, there are a couple of projects that will happen in the frame of forced entertainment. One, a collaboration with a school in the north of England in a place called Goole. It's a very impoverished, small town. And they have, I think 3 or 4 different schools, and the arts centre in Goole has done a really good job of connecting with the schools. And they have a bit of a tradition of working with different artists to sort of activate that relationship, and they've invited us to make a piece in 2021, so that's quite a way away, with a school or some classes from a school. It's not sure yet, but that's one thing that we're kind of concretely working towards. And I'm also working on a project with a festival here in the UK, which will be another performance that's done by young people. And a little bit my thinking for that is, what's the opposite of The Night Follows Day? So something that's unruly, something that's got a very different kind of energy, something that's not concerned with this adult world, but more with the possibility of a world that young people establish that adults step into. So it's like being confronted as an adult with another logic or another way of thinking. Again, that's like 2 years away, so I'm still thinking and beginning some processes to get towards that piece. But I think, both of those projects come out of The Night Follows Day and out of the Art Breakers experience in terms of thinking what could be next down that line.
I think that The Night Follows Day, the first version in Ghent in Campo back then, there's been almost an explosion of groups, including kids on a more and more and young people on a equal level or in various as collaborators in various ways. Has your way of thinking about children and young people also changed during the last 12 years or?
I mean, I would say for me, like, there's a kind of more a focus to my thinking about it, which is, I mean, I think in 2007 when I made the first production of The Night Follows Day, I understood that it was a political work. It was a kind of Brechtian deconstruction of the situation. It was meant as a political work, but I kind of feel now that my sense of the politics of that work is increased. That this possibility to be in a dialogue with different kinds of young people who might not be the kinds of young people that would regularly go to arts events. That's really exciting and interesting. And also I think it feels like we're living in a very reactionary moment politically. You know, we have Brexit, we have the rise of the right wing across Europe. We have so many oppressive and narrowing kind of political forces. It feels really important now when I'm thinking about young people, to think about what are the ways that you can try to hold space open for them, or encourage them in the ways that they're already doing that for themselves. So I think that's a change, which is just a change of emphasis, that it's feels more important and more necessary given the general context that we're in. And I think when I did The Night Follows Day, I was really thinking about the structure of the oppression, basically, the structure of the nature of the box that holds young people, you know. And I think mostly now my thinking is in the other direction. It's about what's the force of playfulness or unruliness or deliberate provocation, incorrect behaviour, deliberate misunderstanding, all of those forces that might have a connection to young people. That seems more like a focus to me now than being obsessed with the weight of power that's pressing down on them.
Is it possible to say that you started with what kids are learning from adults, and now you're looking at what adults might learn from kids and young people?
Yeah, I mean I think
I'm also thinking about Greta Thunberg and maybe adults could profit from.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely, of course, that's. I mean that sounds very clear and very, you know, concrete. I'm not sure it's as strong as that, but I do think that the shift in thinking is about exactly that not so much about what are the power structures that are pressing down on young people, but more what are the ways in which young people might press back and in their own ways against the structures that contain them. And of course, you know, with Greta, you really do feel like it's somebody that doesn't have the investment in the adult structures in so many different ways. And because of that, she's able to say the things that she's saying, and I think that's going to become more and more important. It's what's really compelling about all those young people and the climate strike and so on, that I think it's people who are in one sense dispossessed from the political and social structures, but of course in the longer run they're going to be the inheritors, so they're sort of invoking the sort of moral ownership of the future. And I think it's interesting what it's doing. See how angry people are getting now about her, especially.
I think as well, in that trend that you mentioned about how suddenly it seemed like lots of people were making shows with young people on stage, there can be a kind of leaning on children as the future from adults, I think, in a not very comfortable way. Sometimes a bit cutesy if it's done badly, and also a bit just sort of for adults, which I think is really about lamenting the fact you're getting older or something. I don't know, and so this thing that Tim just said about kind of invoking the moral ownership of the future, I find that particularly exciting because it feels like a reclaiming of something, because I think you're told so much when you're young, or you're asked about what will you do when you grow up, or this will happen, or don't you want this when you grow up, or you have a lot of stuff about the future put on you. So to really, for young people to really claim that and go, and therefore we will start to, if not make the rules, then at the very least push against what we think is unsatisfactory currently, is really exciting. And I think that's part of the thing about seeing the frame that you're within. And the frame so far has generally been the adult's own time. And maybe that's shifting a bit.
Yeah, I think it's complex as well. I mean, I think both Hester and I are sort of we're critical spectators, so we don't like very much of what we see from other people, and we're very critical of our own work also. And I think probably one thing we share is a desire or a demand, really, that artistic work goes far, that it is pushy, and that it's not easy or comfortable. So I think we're well, certainly for myself, I would say there's an interest in work that is unsettling and which opens uncomfortable ways of experiencing for audience, and which takes us into territory that we don't know. And I think, perhaps the worst thing one can feel about a lot of work with young people is that it's safe and comfortable, and the presence of children or young people on stage becomes a way of sort of inoculating the experience. And I think one of my interests is that, for example, when you do a project like That Night Follows Day, because it's got children and young people in it, because then their families will come and their neighbours and so on, you get a different audience than would normally come. There's people who won't come and see forced entertainment, that's for sure. And actually you have a great opportunity there to do something quite challenging. And it's what's one of the great things about presenting that project is you get this extraordinary audience that would never even think of coming to see, you know, a work that is like an hour and 20 minutes long. The whole text is a list. It's got no narrative. It's foul-mouthed. It's confrontational. I mean, all the things that, you know, we're always doing those things, but they would never come. But actually, because it's children and young people, and maybe because there's a personal connection, but all of those things mean that you have a different audience. And I think the responsibility then is to make something that's not messing about. It's really doing something. So there's not particular interest from me in, you know, the young people being there as some kind of feel-good thing, and neither in some sort of sentimental thing either. It's an interest in what they can do and what we can open up together to make a challenging, provocative and boundary-pushing piece of art. I mean, that's the only interest, actually. And I'm not sure that that's what's happening across the board. I think there are ways in which children are sort of roped into things in a soft way that don't particularly interest me, because you know, there are also artists who are in a different way trying to ask their questions and trying to ask the questions with young people that they want to address. So, you know, I respect that, and that's great. But I'm not entirely in love with that wave of work, because too much of it is still, for me, yeah, maybe not so interesting. It's all true.